A clay tablet in the British Museum catalogued as BM 78941 still holds the pressure of a reed stylus that touched it somewhere around 1700 BCE in southern Mesopotamia. The text is Akkadian. The script is dense administrative in rhythm. Partway through the surviving lines, a collective of gods called the Igigi appears, not enthroned, not wielding storms, but digging canals, carrying baskets of earth, and then after what the tablet describes as 40 years of this, they stop. They burn their tools. They march toward the dwelling of a higher god, not to conquer, to refuse. What settled afterward was not punishment. The tablets do not describe chains or exile. They describe a council of senior gods, the Anunnaki, sitting in alarm, realizing that without the Igigi's labour, the rivers they had ordered carved would silt over the embankments, would soften the entire infrastructure of a young cosmos, would begin to fail. The solution proposed was not force, it was invention. And what was invented, according to this tradition, was us. Tonight we follow what the tablets remember of the forgotten gods. We will move through 3 layers: the hierarchy that assigned their labour the night that hierarchy fractured, and the act of creation that emerged not from affection, but from crisis. The narrative comes primarily from the Atrahasis epic, an Akkadian text surviving in fragments across multiple sites, Sippar, Nineveh, and elsewhere. The fullest early version was copied by a scribe named Ku'ya during the Old Babylonian period, roughly the 17th century BCE. 3 tablets, 3 movements. The first describes divine labour and revolt. The second and third carry the story forward into human creation, divine irritation, and flood. The Igigi occupy the opening accent. After that, they recede quietly without farewell into the background of a mythology that remembers kings, floods, and heroes far more readily than the workers who shaped the riverbeds those heroes later sailed. Their name itself is not fully settled. It appears primarily in Akkadian sources. Some scholars read it as a broad reference to heavenly gods. Others treat it as a designation for a specific subordinate class within the divine assembly. In the Atrahasis narrative, the distinction is explicit. The Anunnaki preside, the Igigi serve. Rank is not implied, it is stated, and the labour assigned to them is not symbolic. The tablets describe it as physical, the digging of the Tigris and Euphrates, the carving of irrigation channels, the shaping of a landscape that would one day sustain the earliest cities of southern Mesopotamia. Uruk, Lagash. Fields that needed water managed with precision, because in that flat alluvial plain between 2 unpredictable rivers, drought and flood were separated by very little. The number 40 appears in the text 40 years of toil before the Igigi's patience broke. Whether that figure is literal or symbolic remains open. 40 recurs across ancient Near Eastern literature as a marker of completed endurance, a threshold number. It surfaces in flood accounts, in wilderness narratives, in periods of trial. Here it measures the span between compliance and refusal. 40 years of carrying soil from riverbeds, 40 years of reinforcing embankments against seasonal flooding, 40 years of maintaining a world that did not yet contain a single human being. That last detail deserves a moment of quiet. In this mythic framework, the cosmos before the rebellion is populated entirely by divine beings. There are no cities, no temples filled with offerings, no mortal hands planting grain. The canals being dug are divine infrastructure projects undertaken before humanity exists to benefit from them. The Igigi shape a world they will never inhabit as workers. They prepare the ground for a species that does not yet exist, and they have no knowledge of what is coming. They know only the weight of the basket and the depth of the channel repeated, without variation, without promotion, without end. The Anunnaki, meanwhile, preside in assembly. They deliberate. They assign. They do not dig. This vertical arrangement, authority above labour below, mirrors the social structure of the Mesopotamian civilizations that would later produce these very tablets. Kings did not personally clear silt from canals. Priests did not carry earth on their shoulders. Labourers did. The myth transposes that reality upward into heaven, and in doing so it raises a question. The tablets never quite answer directly if even gods grow weary under unrelieved burden. What does that suggest about systems built on the assumption that those beneath will simply continue? The rebellion, when it comes, arrives at night. The Igigi gather in darkness. They do not petition. They do not send a representative to speak on their behalf. They burn their tools baskets, digging implements the objects that had defined their existence for decades, and they march together toward the residence of Enlil, the god who administered the Earth's functioning, the authority who had issued the assignments. They surround his dwelling. When Enlil demands to know who organized the uprising, they answer as one body. There is no leader. The burden was shared, so is the refusal. What follows the fear among the Anunnaki, the quiet proposal by Enki, the sacrifice of a god whose blood would be mixed with clay to form the first humans, reshapes the structure of existence in ways the tablets trace with careful, almost administrative calm. But all of it begins here in this convergence of exhaustion and solidarity pressed into clay by scribes who understood that the world does not maintain itself, and that the question of who bears the weight is older than any city that they had ever known. We begin where the tablets begin, with the order that existed before it was questioned and the long silence that preceded the first refusal. The architecture before the complaint. In the lower Euphrates floodplain, where the land flattens into a pale horizon of silt and dried salt, archaeologists have uncovered canal beds older than any surviving city wall. Some of these channels were carved so deep and so deliberately that the effort required to move that volume of earth, calculated in later studies based on soil density and estimated labour hours, runs into the tens of thousands of person days. The civilization that depended on those canals understood something essential: the land did not give water freely. It had to be directed, managed and maintained without pause. And the mythology that emerged from that landscape carried the same understanding upward into the realm of the gods. The Atrahasis epic opens not with humanity, but with a cosmos already organized. Heaven and earth have been separated. Domains have been assigned. The text does not narrate the moment of cosmic origin in the way the later Enuma Elish does. There is no battle with a primordial sea goddess here, no splitting of a body to form sky and ground. Instead, the Atrahasis begins after the structure is already in place. The universe is functioning. What it describes is not creation from chaos, but the administration of an established order. And that quiet beginning matters more than it might first appear, because it means the crisis that follows is not born from disorder. It is born from order itself, from a system that operates precisely as designed, until the design proves unsustainable. At the summit of this order stands Anu, sovereign of the heavens. His authority is foundational rather than operational. He does not appear frequently in the day-to-day management of the cosmos. Beneath him, Enlil governs the air and the functioning of the earth. He is the administrator, the enforcer, the god who assigns tasks and expects them completed. His temperament in the tablets tends towards severity. He issues decrees. He demands compliance. When disturbance arises later in the narrative, his instinct is control. Alongside him, though distinct in character, is Enki, known in earlier Sumerian tradition as Ea, the god of subterranean waters, of wisdom, of invention. Where Enlil enforces, Enki improvises. Where Enlil tightens, Enki finds side passages. These two figures will become central to the crisis ahead, but at this stage they simply preside. Together with other high deities, they form the Anunnaki, a term whose Sumerian roots suggest something like princely seed or offspring of Anu, though the etymology remains debated among Assyriologists. In the context of the Atrahasis narrative, the Anunnaki are the senior gods. They sit in assembly, they deliberate, they measure and assign. Their authority is administrative as much as divine, and the tablets convey this with a tone closer to bureaucratic record than to epic poetry. Decisions are made through council. Roles are distributed. The cosmos is managed. Beneath them exists another class of divine beings. The tablets call them the Igigi. They are not mortal. They are not lesser in the sense of being powerless. They are divine in nature, immortal in duration, and capable of awareness and agency. What distinguishes them is function. The Anunnaki decide. The Igigi execute. And what they execute is labour, physical, sustained and heavy. The text describes them digging the beds of rivers, carving irrigation channels, carrying baskets of soil on their shoulders. The language does not soften the task. It is maintenance. It is infrastructure. It is the same work that human labourers in southern Mesopotamia, would later perform under sun and sky generation after generation to keep the canals open and the fields alive. This arrangement authority above labour below mirrors the social architecture of the civilizations that produced these very tablets. In Sumerian and Akkadian cities, kings presided from elevated platforms. Priests mediated between heaven and earth. Labourers dug canals, cleared silt, reinforced embankments. The stratification was not incidental, it was structural, and the mythology reflects that structure with striking precision. If even the gods are divided by rank, then human hierarchy feels not merely practical, but cosmically ordained. For a time, according to the Atrahasis account, the system holds. The Igigi work, the rivers are shaped, the canals deepen, the landscape becomes increasingly ordered. The Anunnaki observe from assemblies, satisfied with progress. There is no description of complaint in this early phase. No murmur of dissatisfaction recorded. The younger gods fulfill their assignments. The older gods maintain oversight. The cosmos is young but operational, yet the text emphasizes something that a casual reading might overlook. The labor is not temporary, it is not seasonal or rotational. There is no mention of rest, no suggestion of shared burden, no mechanism by which the Igigi might rise in status or be relieved of their assignment. The hierarchy is fixed. The Anunnaki do not periodically descend to dig alongside the workers. Authority does not rotate. The vertical arrangement deliberation at the top, excavation at the base is presented as permanent, and permanence in a system where one group bears all the physical weight while another bears none is not stability. It is pressure. The difference is that pressure accumulates silently, and the tablets are quiet about many things that must have been building beneath the surface of compliance. What they do record is what happens when that pressure finally exceeds the structure's capacity to contain it. And that record pressed into clay in neat cuneiform lines describes something remarkably close to what later human societies would recognize in their own histories of burden and refusal. But before that refusal takes shape, the world continues to turn under divine hands. The rivers flow in channels cut by gods who do not yet know they will one day set down their tools. The Anunnaki preside without anticipating challenge, and the land that will eventually host the first human cities is being prepared silently by beings whose names will fade from the record long before the cities rise. The stillness will not last. The tablets remember what came next, not as sudden rupture, but as a slow gathering, a weight that shifted from shoulders to voice. The ones who carried the earth, among the thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from Nineveh's library, the vast collection assembled under Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BC. There are texts that list divine names in long, careful columns. Some of these lists categorize gods by domain, sky, earth, underworld, stormwater. Others organize them by rank. In several of these catalogues, the term Igigi appears not as a single deity, but as a collective designation, a group noun for divine beings whose individual names are largely absent from the record. The Anunnaki receive personal identities Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nana. The Igigi receive a category. That asymmetry, small as it may seem in a list of names, carries weight that extends far beyond scribal convention. It suggests that in the Mesopotamian imagination, the Igigi were understood not as characters, but as a body numerous, unified, and defined less by who they were than by what they did. What they did, according to the Atrahasis narrative, was dig. The text is specific about the nature of their labour in ways that resist abstraction. They carved the beds of the great rivers. They excavated channels meant to direct water across the flat alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia. They carried baskets of earth, a detail that resonates with archaeological evidence from later periods where clay tablets record work quotas for human canal labourers, measured in volumes of soil moved per day. The divine myth does not borrow its imagery from poetic imagination alone. It borrows from the lived economy of effort that defined life along the Tigris and Euphrates, where irrigation was not convenience but survival. Without managed water, crops failed. Without maintained canals, flooding could devastate settlements built on soft, low-lying ground. The Igigi's labour transposed into the heavens reflects what every resident of ancient Sumer would have understood instinctively, that the land required constant physical attention and that someone had to provide it. The tablet does not describe this labour as noble. It does not frame the Igigi's work as sacred duty or divine calling. The language conveys burden. The phrase rendered in many translations as bearing the yoke carries connotations of imposed obligation rather than willing service. The Igigi do not choose their role. It is assigned by the Anunnaki, whose authority to delegate appears unquestioned in the early phase of the narrative. This distinction between assignment and a choice matters because it shapes how the later rebellion is understood. The Igigi are not volunteers who grow tired of a commitment. They are subordinates whose compliance is assumed by those above them, assumed so thoroughly that the possibility of refusal does not appear to have been considered by the senior gods until it actually occurs. Their immortality adds a dimension to the burden that the tablets do not explore explicitly, but that later readers cannot easily ignore. A human labourer digging canals in the marshlands south of Ur might endure years of exhausting work, but mortality provides a boundary. The labour ends, if not through relief, then through death. The Igigi possess no such boundary. They do not age. They do not weaken physically. Their existence stretches forward without natural conclusion, and the work assigned to them carries no expiration. 40 years of toil is the figure given in the Atrahasis text, and whether that number is literal or symbolic, 40 sasiba, being a recurring threshold marker across ancient Near Eastern literature, appearing in flood narratives, wilderness periods and trials of endurance, the implication is the same. The labour was not brief, it was not a transitional phase. It was sustained long enough to reach the limit of what even immortal beings could absorb without fracture. The detail is small in the text, almost administrative in its delivery, but it refuses to disappear once noticed beings who cannot die were nevertheless described as exhausted. The collective anonymity of the Igigi serves the narrative in ways that individual characterization might not, because they have no singular hero among them, no named leader, no divine figure whose personal ambition drives events. Their grievance cannot be reduced to one god's pride or one god's weakness. The complaint belongs to the whole group, the exhaustion shared. The decision to act when it finally comes emerges from solidarity rather than from the charisma of a single dissenter. This is unusual in ancient mythology, where conflicts among divine beings are typically organized around named figures: Marduk against Tiamat Zeus, against Kronos Horus, against Set. The Igigi story operates differently. It is not a story of a hero who rises against tyranny. It is a story of a workforce that reaches collective awareness of imbalance. And that structural difference gives the narrative a quality that later mythologies of divine rebellion often lack. It feels administrative rather than dramatic, systemic rather than personal. Some scholars have noted that the term Igigi itself carries linguistic uncertainty. Its Akkadian usage is clearer than its deeper etymological roots, and in later periods the distinction between Igigi and Anunnaki becomes blurred. Sometimes the terms appear nearly interchangeable in hymns and ritual texts from the first millennium BCE. This fluidity suggests that the sharp division presented in the Atrahasis narrative may reflect one tradition's framework, rather than a universally consistent theology across all of Mesopotamia. The separation between senior gods who deliberate and junior gods who dig may have been drawn more cleanly in this particular text than in the broader religious landscape. Yet the Atrahasis account remains the most detailed surviving narrative of the Igigi's role and rebellion, and within that account the division is explicit. Rank is stayed, labour is assigned downward. The younger gods bear a burden the older gods do not share. Their tools baskets for carrying soil, implements for cutting earth, become extensions of their identity in the narrative. The objects define them. When the moment of refusal arrives, it is the tools that are destroyed first before any confrontation with authority takes place. That sequence suggests something about how identity and function were intertwined in the Mesopotamian divine imagination. To carry the basket was to be the Igigi. To burn the basket was to refuse not only the task but the definition imposed by it. Yet before that burning, before the night that changes the structure of the cosmos, the tools remain in use. The earth is moved. The channels deepen. The rivers are directed along paths that will one day sustain cities whose residents will never know the names of the gods who first carved the ground beneath their foundations. The rhythm of that labour, repetitive, unrewarded, indefinite, is where the next shift begins. Not in a moment of dramatic injustice, but in the slow accumulation of weight that no decree from above ever thought to measure. 40 years and the weight of repetition. How long does patience last when there is no promise that the work will end? The question is not one the Atrahasis tablets pose directly. They are not philosophical texts in the way later Greek or Indian writings might be. They are narrative administrative in tone, concerned with sequence rather than reflection. Yet the question lives inside the text, embedded in a single detail that later readers have returned to repeatedly the span of 40 years. 40 years of digging, 40 years of carrying baskets of earth, 40 years of maintaining channels and embankments across a landscape that did not yet contain a single human settlement. The number sits in the records with the kind of quiet weight that invites pause, because it is not incidental. In ancient Near Eastern literary tradition, 40 is a threshold number, a marker not of precise chronology, but of completed endurance. It appears in flood narratives in periods of wandering and trials that test the limits of what a being can absorb. Its presence in the Atrahasis text signals that the Igigi's labour was not interrupted prematurely. They endured fully. They reached the boundary of what endurance could mean, even for beings who could not die. That last condition, immortality, complicates the meaning of fatigue in ways the tablets do not explore but that the narrative quietly depends upon. A mortal labourer in the canal system south of or Eridu could measure hardship against the certainty that it would one day cease. Death, however unwelcome, provided a horizon. The body would fail. The work would pass to another generation. The Igigi possessed no such horizon. Their bodies did not age. Their strength did not diminish through physical decay. They could in principle dig forever, and that appears to have been precisely the expectation of the Anunnaki, who assigned the labour. The senior gods operated under an assumption that immortality equaled infinite capacity for compliance. The 40-year figure suggests that this assumption was wrong. Immortality removed the boundary of death, but did not remove the boundary of tolerance. The Igigi could not die from exhaustion, but they could be exhausted in a way that made continuation feel indistinguishable from imprisonment. And that distinction between a body that endures and a will that fractures may be the most psychologically modern element in a text composed nearly 4,000 years ago. The tablets do not record the internal conversations of the Igigi during those decades. There are no monologues of frustration, no named figures voicing doubt in quiet moments between shifts. The narrative compresses 40 years into summary. They laboured. The work was heavy, the burden grew, yet beneath that compression, the implication of shared experience is difficult to miss. Beings who dug side by side for decades, who carried the same baskets along the same channels, who watched the same rivers deepen under their collective effort without any change in their status or recognition. Such beings would inevitably develop a common understanding of their position. Solidarity in this account is not ideological. It is experiential. It grows not from speeches or manifestos, but from the repetition of identical days, identical tasks, identical silence from above. The Anunnakis did not descend to inquire about morale. The tablets record no council session in which the welfare of the Igigi was discussed. Authority, it seems, monitored output rather than endurance. The canals deepened, the embankments held, the system appeared to function, and from above function was sufficient. From below function looked different. The Igigi sustained the physical framework of the cosmos, the very infrastructure upon which the Anunnaki's governance depended, yet their contribution earned no adjustment in status. They did not sit in the divine assembly. Their voices did not shape decrees. Their labour was foundational, but their position remained fixed at the base of the hierarchy. This gap between contribution and recognition is not unique to Mesopotamian mythology. It appears in labour disputes across recorded history, in societies ancient and modern, wherever those who maintain essential systems are excluded from the decisions governing those systems. The Atrahasis text does not frame this observation in political language. It simply describes the arrangement and then describes what happened when the arrangement became unbearable. The connection between the two is left for the listener to draw, and the drawing is not difficult. What makes the Igigi's situation particularly striking is the absence of any mechanism for relief. The tablets mention no rotation of duties, no periodic rest, no possibility of appeal. The labour is not described as temporary assignment with a defined endpoint. It is structural, woven into the architecture of the cosmos as permanently as the rivers themselves. The Anunnaki appear to have designed a system in which the Igigi's role was not a phase, but a condition. Enki, for all his later ingenuity, does not intervene during the 40 years to suggest adjustment. Anu, in his distant sovereignty, does not inquire. Enlil, the administrator, enforces the existing arrangement without revision. The system is efficient. It is also rigid. And rigidity, sustained over decades without adaptation, does not produce stability. It produces the precise conditions under which stability shatters, not gradually but all at once when the accumulated weight of unaddressed strain exceeds the structure's capacity to absorb it silently. The night that follows, 40 years of Tiamat arrives in the tablets with little warning. The transition from endurance to action is compressed into a few lines, as though the scribes understood that the shift did not require lengthy explanation. The weight had been building, the threshold had been reached. What remained was the decision, and the decision when it came was not the impulse of a single frustrated god, but the collective recognition of an entire class of beings that the arrangement they had sustained for decades would not change unless they changed it themselves. The Igigi did not wait for reform from above. They did not petition. They gathered in darkness, and in that gathering the structure of the cosmos began to tremble before a single tool was set alight. The night of whispers and burning tools. The Atrahasis narrative does not describe a slow escalation of visible protest. There are no preliminary petitions, no delegation sent to Enlil's assembly, requesting lighter workloads or shared rotation of duties. The transition from decades of silent compliance to organised collective action occurs at least in the surviving text within a compressed sequence that begins in darkness. The Igigi gather at night. The choice of setting is not accidental in Mesopotamian literary tradition, where night often functions as a threshold space, a time when boundaries between states soften and decisions taken carry a different gravity than those made under open sky. The gathering is described as deliberate, not chaotic. The younger gods do not stumble into rebellion through a single moment of rage. They convene. They recognize shared exhaustion. And then they act, not with weapons, not with an assault on the heavens, but with fire directed at the objects that had defined their existence for 40 years. They burn their tools. The image is one of the most striking in the entire Atrahasis account, not because it is violent in the conventional sense, but because of what it signifies within the logic of the narrative. The baskets, the digging implements, the instruments of canal work, these were not merely functional objects. They were the material expression of the Igigi's assigned identity. To carry the basket was to be the labourer. To hold the digging tool was to accept the role imposed from above. By setting those objects alight, the Igigi did not simply halt their work. They severed the connection between themselves and the function that the Anunnaki had treated as permanent. Fire in Mesopotamian culture carried connotations of transformation and purification. It altered the state of what it touched. The burning of tools was therefore not destruction for its own sake. It was a declaration that the previous state of affairs could not be reassembled. The implements were ash. The role they represented was refused. And the refusal, once enacted through fire, could not be quietly reversed by a return to routine. What followed the burning was movement. The Igigi marched together towards the dwelling of Enlil. The text uses language that suggests encirclement, a tightening ring of divine presence around the residence of the god who had administered their labour, who had issued the assignments, who had maintained the hierarchy without adjustment for decades. Enlil's dwelling in Mesopotamian imagination was not an abstract location. It was conceived in terms that mirrored the palaces and temple complexes of human cities gated, walled, elevated. To approach such a gate uninvited was an act laden with implication. The Igigi came not as suppliants bearing offerings. They came with empty hands, their tools destroyed behind them, their intention unmistakable. The march was disciplined rather than frenzied. The surviving lines convey coordination, not riot. The younger gods moved as a unified body, and that unity forged through decades of identical labour in identical conditions proved more unsettling to the Anunnaki than any display of individual defiance might have been. Inside the dwelling, the senior gods became aware of the encirclement. The Atrahasis text describes alarm among the Anunnaki, and the choice of that word alarm rather than anger, at least initially reveals something about the nature of the threat they perceived. This was not a challenge to their power in the sense of a military coup. The Igigi did not arrive with weapons. They did not attempt to breach the gates or seize Enlil's seat of authority. Their threat was structural rather than violent. By surrounding the dwelling and refusing to return to work, they demonstrated that the entire infrastructure of the cosmos, the canals, the embankments, the directed rivers depended on their continued willingness to labour. Without that willingness, maintenance would cease. Rivers would silt over. Channels would collapse. The ordered landscape that the Anunnaki governed would begin to deteriorate. The alarm among the senior gods was therefore not fear of being overthrown, but fear of the system unravelling from beneath a distinction that gives the episode a character quite different from the divine wars found in later mythological traditions. Enlil's response was to demand identification. He wanted a name, a single instigator whose punishment might restore compliance among the rest. The instinct is familiar to anyone who has studied hierarchical responses to collective action across history. Authority seeks to isolate dissent to locate it in one figure whose removal solves the problem. The Igigi denied him that solution. They answered collectively. There was no single leader. The burden had been shared, and so was the refusal. This detail, brief as it is in the surviving text, may be the most structurally significant moment in the entire narrative. By refusing to produce an instigator, the Igigi transformed the crisis from a disciplinary matter into a systemic one. Enlil could not punish his way back to compliance. The grievance was not personal, it was universal among the workers. Every member of the labour force stood outside the gate, and removing one would not return the others to their baskets. The collective voice speaking without a named mouth forced the Anunnaki to confront the complaint itself, rather than deflect it onto a convenient scapegoat. The siege held. The Atrahasis text does not describe its duration in precise terms, but it lasted long enough for the senior gods to move from alarm to deliberation. Anu was informed, his awareness elevating the crisis from a regional labour dispute to a matter of cosmic governance. Enlil's anger, noted in the text, required tempering. The assembly convened not in triumph, but in uncertainty. The gates remained surrounded, the canals remained unattended. For the first time in the mythic timeline, the rhythm of digging had ceased entirely, and the silence where labour used to be must have carried its own kind of weight, the weight of a system, discovering too late that it had never accounted for the possibility of refusal. What emerged from that assembly, the proposal, the sacrifice, the clay would alter the structure of existence permanently. But the decision had not yet been reached. The Anunnaki sat inside, the Igigi stood outside, and between them, at the threshold of Enlil's gate, the entire question of who sustains order and who benefits from it hung unresolved, waiting for a voice wise enough to offer something other than punishment. The trembling of the masters. Fear is not an emotion commonly associated with gods in most mythological traditions. Deities rage desire, celebrate scheme, but trembling before a challenge from below sits uncomfortably within the image of divine authority. Yet the Atrahasis narrative records precisely that response among the Anunnaki when confronted with the Igigi's collective refusal. The senior gods are disturbed, they are alarmed. The text conveys not indignation alone, but something closer to structural anxiety, the recognition that the system they governed had developed a vulnerability they had not anticipated. The Igigi had not attacked. They had not attempted to seize Enlil's throne or claim Anu's heavens. They had simply stopped working and stood together, and that combination cessation paired with unity proved sufficient to unsettle the most powerful beings in the cosmos. The detail is quiet in the text, almost procedural in its delivery, but it carries an implication that extends well beyond this single episode authority that depends on labour. It does not share as authority that can be destabilised by withdrawal alone. Inside the assembly deliberation replaced the initial shock. The Anunnaki convened in the manner described across multiple Mesopotamian mythological texts. A council of senior gods gathered to weigh options and issue decrees. The format is consistent with how divine governance appears throughout Sumerian and Akkadian literature. Gods do not act unilaterally in most of these traditions. They discuss, they debate, they reach decisions through collective agreement even when individual figures like Enlil or Anu carry greater weight. This procedural quality gives the crisis a tone that feels less like cosmic drama and more like institutional emergency, a board confronting a systemic failure it had not modelled for. Anu, as highest sovereign, was informed. His awareness elevated the matter beyond Enlil's administrative domain. Enlil himself, whose anger is noted in the text, had to be tempered by the practical reality that punishment alone could not restore the canals. Destroying the Igigi, even if such a thing were possible within the narrative's logic, would remove the only workforce sustaining the physical world. The senior gods faced a dilemma with no comfortable resolution: coerce and risk losing the labourers entirely, or concede and risk undermining the hierarchy that justified their authority. It was Enki who shifted the terms of the problem. His role in this episode is consistent with his broader characterization across Mesopotamian mythology, the god who solves by invention rather than enforcement. In the Sumerian tradition, where he is known as Ea Enki, is associated with the subterranean fresh waters with craft, with the kind of intelligence that finds lateral solutions to vertical problems. He does not dismiss the Igigi's grievance. He does not propose punishment. Instead, he reframes the question entirely. If the younger gods will no longer perform the labour, then the labour need not disappear. It can be transferred. A new being can be fashioned, one capable of the physical work required to maintain canals, fields, and embankments. The proposal is radical, not because it introduces creation gods in Mesopotamian myth create regularly, but because it acknowledges that the existing arrangement has failed and that adaptation rather than restoration is the appropriate response. Some scholars have noted that this moment represents one of the earliest narrative instances in which systemic reform is depicted as preferable to punitive enforcement, though applying modern political terminology to a text composed in the 17th century BCE requires obvious caution. The solution Enki proposed required sacrifice, not metaphorical sacrifice, but literal divine death. A god would be killed, his blood would be mixed with clay from the earth. From that mixture, a new species would be shaped, one possessing both physical substance and divine awareness. The god selected in the most commonly cited versions of the text is named Gesh-du-e, or Wiyila, described in the tablets as a deity who possessed intelligence or discernment. The Akkadian term used Temu carries connotations of understanding, planning capacity, the ability to perceive and reason. This was not a minor god chosen at random. The intelligence embedded in his blood would pass into the beings created from it. Humanity in this account would inherit not merely the capacity for labour, but the capacity for thought, a detail whose implications the narrative does not immediately pursue, but that resonates forward through every subsequent crisis in the Atrahasis epic. Beings created with divine intelligence are not tools. They are potential agents capable of the same awareness that led the Igigi to recognize their own burden. The solution contained from its inception the seed of future tension. The assembly agreed. The decision is presented in the text with the same procedural calm that characterizes much of the Atrahasis account: deliberation, consensus, execution. There is no dramatic vote, no dissenting faction among the Anunnaki recorded in the surviving fragments. The practical logic appears to have been persuasive. The Igigi would be relieved. The world would continue to be maintained. Hierarchy would be preserved though restructured. The Anunnaki would remain sovereign. A new class of beings, neither divine nor entirely separate from divinity, would assume the physical burden. The elegance of the solution from the Anunnaki's perspective was that it addressed the grievance without conceding authority. The senior gods did not apologize. They did not acknowledge fault in the original arrangement. They simply adapted the system to accommodate a reality they could no longer deny, that the beings who sustained their world had the capacity and the will to refuse, and that no amount of hierarchical assumption could override that capacity indefinitely. The Igigi still gathered outside Enlil's gate would have received the decision as resolution. Their labour was ending. Their refusal had not resulted in punishment or exile, but in structural change. The canals they had dug for 40 years would soon be maintained by other hands, hands not yet formed, belonging to beings not yet breathing. The moment of transition hovered between the assembly's decree and its execution, between the world as it had been and the world as it was about to become. What remained was the act itself, the gathering of clay, the spilling of divine blood, the shaping of forms that would inherit the weight the gods had finally set down. And that act, quiet, deliberate, described in the tablets with ritual precision, would prove to be not an ending, but a beginning. whose consequences neither the Anunnaki nor the Igigi could fully foresee. What the tablets do not settle. Not every detail in the Atrahasis narrative sits as firmly as the retelling might suggest. The story of the Igigi, their labour, their rebellion, the creation of humanity as consequence arrives in modern awareness through a chain of transmission that includes fragmented, contested translations and interpretive choices made by scholars working across more than a century of Assyriology. Before following the narrative further into the act of creation and its aftermath, it is worth pausing at the points where certainty softens, where the evidence supports more than one reading, and where the desire for a coherent story may press harder on the material than the material can comfortably bear. This is not a detour from the subject, it is part of it. The tablets themselves are incomplete, and honouring what they preserve means also acknowledging what they leave open. The term Igigi presents the first area of genuine scholarly uncertainty. In the Atrahasis epic, the distinction between Igigi and Anunnaki is drawn clearly, senior gods above labouring gods, below hierarchy explicit. Yet this clean separation does not hold uniformly across the broader corpus of Mesopotamian religious literature. In texts from the first millennium BCE, particularly in hymns, ritual incantations and god lists, recovered from sites like Ashur and Nineveh, the two terms occasionally appear nearly interchangeable. Some passages use Igigi to refer to heavenly gods generally, without any implication of subordinate labour. Others use Anunnaki to designate underworld deities rather than a ruling council. The fluidity of these terms across centuries and regions suggests that the sharp division central to the Atrahasis narrative may represent one tradition's theological framework, rather than a fixed universally accepted cosmology. The story of labourers rebelling against administrators depends on that division of being real and meaningful within the mythic world. If the division was less stable than the Atrahasis account implies, if later scribes and priests did not consistently maintain the distinction, then the rebellion narrative may reflect a particular literary tradition rather than a broadly shared Mesopotamian understanding of divine hierarchy. The discomfort is not that the story is false, it is that the categories it relies upon may have been more fluid than a single text can convey. The number 40 introduces a related but distinct uncertainty. 40 years of labour is the figure given for the span of Igigi toil before the rebellion, and the narrative builds emotional weight on that duration, decades of repetition, the slow accumulation of collective exhaustion, the psychological toll of work without variation or end. Yet 40 is one of the most conventional numbers in ancient Near Eastern literature. It appears in the Hebrew Bible's account of wilderness wandering and flood durations in periods of mourning and fasting. Its recurrence across traditions suggests that it functions less as a precise measurement of time than as a literary signal, meaning a complete and sufficient period long enough to matter, long enough to mark transformation. Treating the 40 years in Atrahasis as a foundation for detailed psychological analysis of the Igigi's internal experience means constructing a narrative on a number that may have been chosen for its symbolic resonance rather than its chronological accuracy. The tablets do not clarify which reading is intended. They state the number and move forward. The emotional architecture built upon that number in modern retellings, the slow erosion of patience, the growing awareness of systemic injustice may be legitimate interpretation, but it is interpretation nonetheless shaped as much by modern sensibility as by ancient text. Perhaps the most significant caution concerns the framing of the Igigi's rebellion as a labour strike. The comparison is compelling and has appeared in scholarly commentary as well as popular accounts. The structural parallels are real. A workforce subjected to prolonged, unrelieved burden refuses to continue, confronts the authority that imposed the conditions, and forces a systemic renegotiation. The pattern maps recognisably onto modern industrial disputes, yet applying the concept of a labour strike with its associations of collective bargaining, workers' rights and political consciousness to a mythological narrative composed in a pre-industrial theocratic society carries risks of anachronism that deserve acknowledgement. The Atrahasis scribes were not describing a political event. They were narrating a divine crisis within a cosmological framework where hierarchy was not a social construct to be challenged, but a feature of reality itself. The Igigi's refusal may have resonated with ancient listeners who knew the exhaustion of canal work, but the text does not frame the rebellion as a model for human action or as commentary on social justice. It frames it as a problem within divine administration that required a practical solution. Reading it as proto-political narrative is a modern overlay, not necessarily wrong, but not necessarily present in the original intent either. Some researchers argue this distinction matters little, that myth speaks beyond its author's conscious framing. Others maintain that importing modern categories distorts the text's own logic. The tension between these positions does not resolve neatly, and the honest response may be to hold both possibilities without forcing either to prevail. These uncertainties do not diminish the Atrahasis narrative, they contextualize it. The story of the Igigi remains one of the most remarkable accounts of divine rebellion in ancient literature, remarkable precisely because it treats the rebellion with pragmatic neutrality rather than moral condemnation, and because it links the origin of humanity to a crisis of labour rather than an act of cosmic love or divine whim. What the skeptic's eye reveals is not that the story is unreliable, but that its edges are softer than a confident retelling might suggest. The terms shift across traditions. The numbers carry symbolic weight that may or may not correspond to narrative realism. The modern frameworks through which we interpret the text illuminate certain patterns while potentially obscuring others. The tablets preserve what they preserve fragments of a tradition that was already ancient when the surviving copies were made, passed through generations of scribal hands that may have understood the same words differently. What remains after accounting for these uncertainties is still substantial a narrative in which divine beings refuse imposed labour, in which authority is forced to adapt, rather than simply punish, and in which the creation of humanity emerges not from serenity, but from the pressure of an unsustainable system. That core pattern persists regardless of how precisely we define the terms or how literally we read the numbers. It persists because it describes something that does not require modern vocabulary to recognize the moment when endurance reaches its limit and the structure built upon that endurance must find another way to stand. Clay and blood at the edge of the Apsu. The clay would have come from near the water. In Mesopotamian tradition, Enki's domain was the Apsu, the body of fresh subterranean water that lay beneath the surface of the earth, feeding springs, wells, and the deep roots of marshland. It was not an ocean, it was not rain, it was the hidden freshwater source that sustained life from below, and in the mythological imagination it functioned as both a physical location and a conceptual space associated with wisdom craft and the kind of generative power that produces new forms from raw material. The Atrahasis text situates the act of creation within this domain. Clay is gathered, a god is sacrificed. The two substances, earth and divine blood, are mixed together under the supervision of Enki and the birth goddess whose name appears in various traditions as Nintumami or Belesi Li. The process is not spontaneous. It is described with ritual precision, as though the scribes understood that the making of a new species required not just material but ceremony, not just substance but intention spoken aloud in words that bound the act to cosmic order. The creation of humanity in this account is neither accident nor gift. It is procedure. The god chosen for sacrifice is named in most surviving versions as Geshtu-i, sometimes rendered as We-ila. The tablets describe him with a specific quality he possesses, Temu, an Akkadian term that carries the weight of intelligence, discernment, the capacity for planning and understanding. This was not an arbitrary selection. The intelligence within his blood would transfer to the being shaped from the mixture. Humanity would inherit awareness from a divine source embedded at the level of composition, rather than granted later as an external blessing. The detail matters because it determines the nature of the species being created. Beings fashioned from clay alone would be material strong, perhaps capable of labour, but lacking the inner quality that distinguishes a worker who merely performs from a worker who perceives, remembers, and eventually questions. By infusing the clay with blood that carried Temu, the gods ensured that humanity would possess consciousness. Whether they fully understood the implications of that decision is something the tablets do not address, but the consequences would surface soon enough in the narrative. A species created with the divine intelligence to replace divine labourers carries within it from the first breath the same capacity for dissatisfaction that drove the Igigi to rebellion. The solution to one crisis contained the architecture of the next, and the quiet irony of that recursion sits beneath the text like water beneath the apsu, present, generative, and unacknowledged by the gods who set it in motion. The birth goddess plays a role in the creation scene that the narrative treats as essential rather than peripheral. She shapes the clay. She speaks as incantations. In some versions, she counts the days of gestation as though the first humans required a period of formation analogous to biological pregnancy. This detail connects the act of creation to embodied experience in a way that purely abstract accounts of the divine making often do not. The goddess does not simply will humanity into existence. She works with material, she molds, she monitors. The process has duration. It has physical steps. Archaeological evidence from across Mesopotamia confirms that clay was the fundamental medium of the civilization tablets. Bricks, figurines, vessels, seals. A culture that built its cities from clay, recorded its laws on clay, and shaped its sacred images in clay would naturally imagine its gods using the same substance to fashion the beings who would maintain the world. The mythic material and the lived material converge. Creation is not performed in some otherworldly medium. It is performed in the substance that every Mesopotamian knew intimately, the earth beneath their feet pulled wet from riverbeds, shaped by hands and dried under the same sun that would later bear down on the labourers those first humans were made to become. The sacrifice of Geshtu-e introduces a dimension that separates this creation account from many others in the ancient world. Humanity does not emerge from divine overflow, from surplus power, or from playful experimentation. It emerges from divine death. A god is killed so that something new can be made. His blood, the carrier of intelligence, is not donated willingly as far as the text indicates. It is taken through ritual slaughter agreed upon by the assembly. The violence of the act sits quietly within the narrative, neither celebrated nor mourned at length. The Anunnaki approved. The deed was performed. The blood mixed with our earth, forms were shaped. The text moves forward with the same procedural calm that characterizes the rest of the Atrahasis account, as though the death of a god were simply another step in an administrative process. Yet the weight of it lingers. Humanity's origin in this tradition is not innocent. It is rooted in sacrifice. A divine life ended, so that mortal lives could begin, a consciousness extinguished, so that a different form of consciousness could be distributed across an entirely new species. Every human being in the logic of this myth carries a trace of that original act. The blood that runs through mortal veins was once divine. The intelligence that allows a person to plan, to remember, to question is inherited from a god who was killed to make the inheritance possible. The first humans once formed did not wake into a world of leisure or discovery. They woke into a world of expectation. The canals waited. The fields required tending. The embankments needed reinforcement. The purpose of their creation was explicit in the narrative. They were made to bear the yoke, to assume the labour the Igigi had refused to maintain, the infrastructure of a cosmos that could not sustain itself without physical effort. There was no garden, no period of wandering innocence, no gradual discovery of purpose. The Atrahasis account is direct. Humanity was created to work. The tools that the Igigi had burned would be remade in mortal hands. The baskets that had carried divine soil would now carry human soil. The rhythm of digging, carrying, returning and beginning again, the same rhythm that had driven immortal beings to rebellion, was transferred to beings whose mortality ensured they could then never accumulate 40 years of unified resentment in a single generation. Death in this arrangement functioned as a pressure valve. Each generation would labour age and pass the burden to the next. The continuity of work would be maintained not through immortal endurance but through biological reproduction. The system redesigned by Enki's ingenuity addressed the flaw that had caused the Igigi's revolt, not the existence of labour itself, but the absence of any boundary upon it. Whether the gods recognized this as compromise or simply as efficiency, the tablets do not say. What they record is that the clay dried, the forms breathed, and the world entered a new phase, one in which divinity and mortality shared substance and in which the burden of sustaining order passed from heaven to earth, with all the quiet permanence of a river finding its new channel. The inheritance of the yoke. The phrase appears in several translations of the Atrahasis text with minor variation, but consistent meaning humanity was created to bear the yoke. The Akkadian word rendered as yoke to pshiku, in some readings carries connotations not of gentle responsibility, but of imposed burden, the kind of weight placed on the neck of an animal or the shoulders of a labourer who does not choose the load but receives it as condition of existence. It is a word bearer that connects the mythic act of creation to the physical reality of Mesopotamian agricultural life, where the yoke was not metaphor but daily instruments seen on oxen, pulling ploughs through heavy alluvial soil and understood by every farmer, every canal worker, every builder of mud brick walls who had felt the weight of carried earth compress the body downward over hours of unbroken effort. To say that humanity was created to bear the yoke is to say within the logic of this tradition that labour was not a consequence of human failure or divine punishment. It was the original purpose. The first breath drawn by the first human being in this account was drawn in a world that already had tasks weighting canals, silting embankments, softening rivers, pressing against banks that no one had reinforced since the Igigi set down their tools and walked toward Enlil's gate. The transfer of labour from divine to mortal hands resolved the immediate crisis but introduced dynamics. The Atrahasis text traces with a subtlety that rewards slow reading. The Igigi were relieved. Their 40 years of digging ended not in punishment but in substitution. They returned to the heavenly host, still divine, still immortal, still part of the cosmic order, but no longer defined by baskets of soil and the rhythm of excavation. The text does not describe their reaction in detail. There is no recorded celebration, no speech of gratitude, no formal acknowledgement of what they had endured. They simply ceased to labour. The narrative silence surrounding their relief may reflect scribal economy the story needed to move forward toward the new relationship between gods and humans, but it also suggests that within the mythic framework the Igigi's return to the divine assembly was unremarkable. They resumed their place, the system adjusted, the cosmos continued. What had been a structural crisis became in the space of a few cuneiform lines a settled arrangement. The speed of that transition is itself noteworthy. 40 years of accumulated grievance, a night of burning tools and besieged gates, the sacrifice of a god, the creation of an entirely new species, and then quiet. The efficiency of the resolution says something about how the Atrahasis tradition understood conflict not as a permanent scar on the cosmic order, but as a pressure event that once addressed allowed the system to resume functioning in a modified form. Humanity, meanwhile, entered existence already embedded in obligation. The Atrahasis account offers no interlude of innocence, no period in which the first humans explored the world without assigned purpose. They were made to work and they began working. The fields required cultivation. The irrigation channels demanded the same constant attention that the Igigi had provided, clearing silt after seasonal flooding, reinforcing banks against erosion, extending networks to reach new areas of arable land. The landscape of southern Mesopotamia where this tradition took shape was not forgiving terrain for agriculture. The alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates was flat, poorly drained, and subject to unpredictable flooding. Salinization threatened fields that were irrigated without adequate drainage. The margin between productive harvest and catastrophic failure was narrow, and maintaining that margin required labour that was not seasonal but perpetual. The myth captures this reality with precision. The burden did not vanish when it changed hands. It continued identical in nature, different only in the beings who performed it. Canals dug by gods would be maintained by mortals. The rivers shaped by immortal effort would be managed by creatures whose lifespans measured decades rather than eternities. That difference in lifespan introduced what may have been, from the Anunnaki's perspective, the most practical feature of the new arrangement. The Igigi had accumulated 40 years of shared exhaustion and converted it into collective action. Their immortality allowed grievance to compound without the interruption of generational turnover. A single workforce labouring without replacement built solidarity through unbroken shared experience. Humanity's mortality disrupted that pattern. Each generation would labour, age, and die. The next generation would begin the work anew, inheriting the task, but not the accumulated resentment of its predecessors. Death functioned as a reset mechanism within the system, not eliminating the burden, but preventing it from consolidating into the kind of unified, long-duration dissatisfaction that had driven the Igigi to rebellion. Whether the gods designed this feature consciously, or whether it emerged as an incidental consequence of creating mortal beings, the Atrahasis text does not specify. Yet the structural effect is clear. Mortality fragmented the experience of labour across generations in a way that immortality had not, and that fragmentation made the system more resilient against the precise kind of collective refusal that had destabilised it before. Yet mortality alone did not define the new relationship between gods and humanity. Over time, according to the broader Mesopotamian literary tradition, another dimension emerged, the exchange of offerings. Humans cultivated fields-raised livestock, and from the products of their labour provided sacrifices to the gods, grain animals, beer oil. Temples became the institutional centres of this exchange, staffed by the priests who mediated between mortal effort and divine need. The gods, who no longer dug canals or carried earth, received sustenance through ritual. The Atrahasis text does not elaborate extensively on this sacrificial economy in its earliest sections, but the pattern appears unmistakably in the flood narrative that follows when Atrahasis emerges from the vessel after the deluge and offers sacrifice. The gods gather around the offering drawn to the centre, detail preserved in later versions, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the imagery is vivid enough to suggest that divine dependence on human offerings was understood as real within the mythic framework rather than merely symbolic. The beings created to replace divine labour also became the beings who fed divine existence. The relationship was not one-directional. It was reciprocal, though asymmetrical. Humans provided material sustenance through sacrifice, and gods provided cosmic stability through governance. The hierarchy remained vertical, but it now contained a thread of mutual dependence that had not existed when the Igigi performed all the labour, and the Anunnaki received all the authority without material exchange. This new equilibrium labour transferred offerings flowing upward, divine order maintained through mortal hands held within the mythic timeline. For a span the text does not precisely measure, humanity multiplied, settlements formed. The noise of growing population rose from the earth toward the heavens, and within that noise, within the clamour of a species that had been made to work but had also been made with divine intelligence, the conditions for the next crisis were already assembling quietly, incrementally, in the same way that pressure had once gathered among the Igigi before anyone above thought to notice. The noise that rose from below. The Akkadian word is rigmu. It appears in the Atrahasis narrative at the point where the story shifts from the consequences of creation to the consequences of success. Rigmu means noise, clamour. The accumulated sound of a population growing beyond its original parameters. It is not a word that implies malice or sin. It does not describe rebellion or defiance in the way the Igigi's actions were framed. It describes volume, the sheer auditory presence of a species that was multiplying building settlements, cultivating land, and generating the kind of constant low-level disturbance that accompanies any expanding community. In the mythic framework of the Atrahasis epic, this noise rises from the earth to the heavens. It reaches the ears of Enlil, and Enlil, the administrator, who had once assigned the Igigi their labour, and who had trembled when they refused it, responds not with curiosity or adjustment, but with irritation. The god who governs order finds disorder in the sound of the very beings created to preserve that order. The cycle that began with the Igigi's exhaustion enters a new rotation, different in participants, similar in structure. A system produces strain. Authority reacts. The question once again is how. The Atrahasis text describes Enlil's response in stages, each escalating beyond the last. First he sends plague. The intention appears to be reduction. Fewer humans would produce less noise, restoring the quiet that Enlil associated with proper cosmic function. Enki, whose role as mediator and protector of humanity becomes increasingly central in this portion of the narrative, intervenes. He instructs Atrahasis, the exceptionally wise human, whose name gives the epic its title, to direct his people's prayers toward a specific deity associated with plague, thereby averting the worst of the devastation. The plague recedes, humanity recovers, the noise returns. Enlil then sends drought. Fields wither, water becomes scarce. Again, Enki finds a way to guide Atrahasis through the crisis, preserving enough of the population to continue. Again, recovery follows. Again, the noise rises. The pattern repeats with a rhythm that mirrors the earlier cycle of Igigi labour, an accumulating grievance, though now The burden falls on humanity, and the authority responding is not a distant, uninvolved sovereign, but an increasingly frustrated administrator whose tolerance for disturbance narrows with each failed attempt at suppression. What neither plague nor drought accomplished through partial measures, Enlil eventually determines to achieve through total action. He proposes a flood, not a seasonal inundation of the kind southern Mesopotamia experienced regularly, but a comprehensive deluge intended to erase humanity entirely and restore the silence that preceded their creation. The flood narrative within the Atrahasis epic shares structural elements with accounts preserved in other ancient Near Eastern traditions, the story of Ziusudra, in earlier Sumerian fragments, the flood episode in the later Epic of Gilgamesh, and the account of Noah in the Hebrew Bible's Book of Genesis. Scholars have debated the relationships among these versions for over a century since George Smith's initial publication of the Gilgamesh flood tablet in 1872 generated widespread recognition that the biblical account had ancient Mesopotamian parallels. Direct borrowing, shared oral tradition, and independent development from common cultural memory have all been proposed as explanations. What remains consistent across the versions is the basic structure. Divine authority decides to destroy humanity through water. One individual is warned and instructed to build a vessel. Life is preserved through that vessel, and the post-flood world operates under modified conditions. In the Atrahasis account, it is Enki who provides the warning, not by speaking directly to Atrahasis, which would violate a divine oath of secrecy, but by speaking to a reed wall behind which Atrahasis happens to be listening. The detail is a characteristic of Enki's approach throughout the tradition, technically compliant with the letter of divine agreement, while thoroughly subverting its intent. The wall hears, the man behind the wall hears, the oath is not broken, the information is transmitted, and the vessel is built. The flood itself, when it arrives in the narrative, is described with a force that unsettles even the gods who authorized it. The Atrahasis text records divine beings cowering at the destruction they unleashed, pressed against the walls of heaven, frightened by the magnitude of the deluge. This detail carries an echo of the earlier episode where the Anunnaki trembled before the Igigi's siege. Authority in both instances confronts consequences it did not fully anticipate. The gods who approved the flood did not foresee the totality of what it would mean, the erasure of the offerings that sustained them, the silence not of peace but of absence, the realization that destroying humanity meant destroying the only beings who maintained the world's infrastructure and provided the gods with sacrificial sustenance. When Atrahasis emerges after the waters recede and offers sacrifice on the cleansed earth, the gods gather around the offering with an intensity the text conveys through visceral imagery. They had been deprived. The flood had not merely punished humanity, it had starved the divine realm of the exchange upon which it had come to depend. The reciprocal relationship established after the Igigi's rebellion, humans labour and offer gods govern and maintain, had been severed by the very authority meant to preserve it. Enlil's solution had undermined Enlil's system. The post-flood settlement described in the Atrahasis narrative introduces measures designed to prevent the recurrence of the crisis. Humanity is preserved but constrained. Mortality is reaffirmed. In some versions, additional limitations are imposed, infertility among certain groups. Infant mortality, priestly celibacy mechanisms intended to regulate population growth and prevent the noise from reaching the threshold that had triggered divine intervention. The cosmos recalibrates. The flood becomes not an ending, but a boundary marker, a point after which the relationship between gods and humans operates under revised terms. The pattern is familiar by now. Strain accumulates, authority reacts. Adaptation follows. The Igigi refused to dig and humanity was created. Humanity multiplied beyond comfort, and the flood was sent. The flood proved unsustainable as a solution, and post-diluvian constraints were imposed. Each crisis produces a modified equilibrium. Each equilibrium contains within it the conditions for future strain. The cycle does not resolve. It rotates. What connects the Igigi's rebellion to the flood is not direct causation but structural rhyme. Both episodes describe systems under pressure from below pressure that authority initially ignores, then attempts to suppress, then is forced to accommodate through structural change. The Igigi's refusal led to creation. Humanity's proliferation led to near annihilation and then to regulated continuation. In both cases, Enki serves as the mediating intelligence that preserves continuity while allowing transformation. And in cycles does both. The Anunnaki discover that governance requires more than decree. It requires responsiveness to the systems. It depends upon a lesson. The tablets present not as moral instruction, but as observed pattern, recorded with the same administrative calm that characterizes a civilization accustomed to managing rivers that could nourish or destroy depending on how carefully they were watched. The flood recedes, the world is quieter, humanity continues under new constraints, and the Igigi somewhere in the heavenly host observe a species learning what they had learned long before, that the weight of sustaining order falls unevenly, and that the structures built to manage that weight must adapt or face the consequences of their own rigidity. From workers to watchers. One tradition remembers them digging, another remembers them watching. The distance between those two images, hands in earth versus eyes from heaven, spans centuries of cultural transmission, theological evolution, and the slow reshaping of older motifs into newer frameworks. Yet the structural outline persists across both. A group of divine beings ranked beneath a higher authority occupies an assigned role within a cosmic hierarchy. At some point that role is disrupted. The disruption produces consequences that reshape the relationship between the divine realm and the human world. In the Mesopotamian account, the Igigi dig canals and rebel through collective refusal. In the later tradition preserved in Jewish apocalyptic literature, particularly the Book of Enoch, composed in stages between roughly the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE, a group known as the Watchers descends from heaven, interacts with humanity in ways that transgress assigned boundaries and suffers punishment that the Igigi never received. The parallels do not map precisely, the motivations differ, the consequences diverge, yet the shared architecture of the two narratives invites attention. Not because one necessarily borrowed from the other, but because both grapple with the same underlying question. What happens when beings positioned between the highest divine authority and the human world step outside the role they were given? The Watchers, known in the Aramaic and Hebrew traditions as Irin or Egregoroi in Greek translation, are described as a class of angelic beings assigned to observe humanity from a celestial vantage. Their role is supervisory rather than laborious. They watch. The name itself carries that function as its defining characteristic. In the Anunnaki tradition, particularly the section known as the Book of the Watchers, a group of these beings descends to earth drawn by the beauty of human women. They take wives. They father offspring the Nephilim, described as giants whose presence on earth introduces violence and corruption. The Watchers also transmit forbidden knowledge to humanity: metallurgy, cosmetics, the reading of celestial signs, the arts of warfare. Their transgression is framed in moral terms. They have crossed a boundary established by God, mingling the divine with the human in ways that contaminate both realms. The punishment is severe. The Watchers are bound and confined beneath the earth until the day of final judgment. Their offspring are destroyed. The corruption they introduced becomes one of the justifications for the flood that follows in the broader narrative. The tone is not administrative, it is apocalyptic. Where the Atrahasis account presents rebellion as a labour dispute resolved through creative compromise, the Enochic tradition presents transgression as moral catastrophe resolved through confinement and destruction. The contrast in tone reveals a fundamental shift in theological emphasis between the two cultural contexts, from the pragmatic system-oriented cosmology of ancient Mesopotamia to the moral covenant-oriented theology of Second Temple Judaism. Yet beneath that contrast, the structural similarities are difficult to dismiss entirely. Both traditions describe a subordinate class of divine beings. Both situate those beings within a hierarchy governed by a supreme authority, the Anunnaki Council in one case, God in the other. Both narratives involve a disruption initiated by the subordinate group. Both disruptions produce consequences that alter the human world. And in both traditions, the boundary between divine and human realms is crossed in ways that prove irreversible. The Igigi's rebellion leads to the creation of humanity from clay mixed with divine blood, a crossing of the boundary between divine essence and earthly substance. The Watcher's descent leads to the birth of hybrid offspring and the transmission of divine knowledge to mortal minds, another form of boundary crossing, though framed as corruption rather than creation. The Atrahasis account embeds divine intelligence in humanity through the sacrifice god's blood. The Enochic account describes divine knowledge reaching humanity through the Watcher's teaching. In both cases, something passes from the higher realm to the lower one, and the passage cannot be reversed. The detail is small enough to be coincidental, but persistent enough to have drawn scholarly attention for over a century. The question of direct influence remains unresolved and may be unresolvable with current evidence. Mesopotamian cultural motifs circulated widely across the ancient Near East through trade conquest, diplomatic exchange, and the movement of scribal traditions. The city of Babylon itself became a site of Jewish exile in the 6th century BCE, and the contact between Jewish and Mesopotamian literary traditions during and after that period is well documented. The flood narrative in Genesis bears unmistakable structural resemblance to the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh accounts. The concept of a divine assembly appears in both Mesopotamian and early Israelite texts. It is not implausible that the motif of subordinate divine beings who disrupt cosmic order travelled along similar channels. Yet plausibility is not proof, and some scholars argue that the Watcher tradition developed independently from internal Jewish theological concerns, specifically the need to explain the origin of evil and the existence of corrupt knowledge in a world created by a just God. The Igigi's rebellion addresses a different problem entirely: the distribution of labour within a divine bureaucracy. The motivations are distinct enough that shared structure could reflect common patterns of mythic thinking rather than direct textual transmission. Human cultures across many geographies and periods have generated stories about divine beings who cross boundaries and face consequences. The pattern may be fundamental to how hierarchical cosmologies process the tension between order and disruption, regardless of whether specific traditions are connected by historical contact. What remains worth noting is the trajectory of transformation that the Igigi undergo across cultural memory. In the oldest Mesopotamian layers, they are workers defined by physical labour, characterized by collective identity resolved through systemic adaptation rather than moral punishment. In the later traditions that may or may not carry echoes of their story, the subordinate divine beings become observers, then transgressors, then prisoners. The tone shifts from pragmatic to moralistic. The consequence shifts from redistribution to condemnation. Labour gives way to surveillance. Exhaustion gives way to desire. Structural compromise gives way to eternal confinement. Whether this arc represents direct evolution of a single tradition or parallel expressions of a shared mythic instinct, the direction of change is consistent from a world where divine rebellion is treated as administrative problem to a world where divine rebellion is treated as cosmic sin. The Igigi in their earliest form occupy the first point on their arc, beings whose refusal is acknowledged, accommodated, and then quietly absorbed into the order it had momentarily disrupted. What later traditions made of that refusal, if indeed they made anything of it at all, belongs to a different chapter of cultural history, one written in Aramaic and Greek rather than Akkadian cuneiform, and shaped by theological concerns that the scribes of ancient Babylon might not have recognized as their own. The Igigi did not become the Watchers in any textually provable sense, but something in the pattern travelled the idea of beings between heaven and earth whose role shifts, whose boundaries blur, whose story continues to be retold long after the original tablets have crumbled. And that persistence, whether born of influence or of independent recognition, suggests that the questions embedded in their narrative were never fully answered by any single tradition that inherited them. The gods who were not called evil. There is a line that later mythological traditions almost always cross when telling stories of divine rebellion, and it is the line between descent and damnation. In the Greek tradition, the Titans who oppose Zeus are cast into Tartarus, a prison beneath the underworld sealed and permanent. In the Christian theological inheritance, the angel who defies God becomes Satan, the adversary, the embodiment of corruption, exiled from heaven into eternal opposition. In Norse mythology, Loki's transgressions lead to binding to a serpent dripping venom onto his face until the end of the world. The pattern across these traditions is consistent divine beings who challenge the established order are not merely defeated, they are morally redefined. Their rebellion becomes the marker of their nature. They are cast as proud, corrupt, envious, fallen. The act of defiance transforms them from participants in the divine order into its antithesis. Rebellion and evil become in these later frameworks nearly synonymous. The Atrahasis narrative does not cross that line. The Igigi rebel, and the tablets do not call them wicked. They refuse to labour, and the text does not describe their refusal as sin. They burn their tools around Enlil's dwelling and speak with a collective voice that demands relief, and the response from the senior gods is not moral condemnation but structural adaptation. The absence of that condemnation, quiet as it is in the text, may be one of the most distinctive features of the entire account. The tablets describe the Igigi's grievance in language that acknowledges its legitimacy. The labour was heavy, the burden was prolonged, the system offered no mechanism for relief. When the Anunnaki tremble at the siege, their fear is practical. They recognise that the infrastructure of the cosmos depends on the Igigi's continued effort, but it is not accompanied by moral outrage at the act of defiance itself. Enlil demands to know who instigated the uprising, which suggests anger, but the collective response of the Igigi effectively deflects that anger away from any individual target and toward the systemic complaint. The assembly that follows deliberates not on punishment but on solution. Enki's proposal to create humanity is accepted not as a way of replacing disgraced rebels, but as a way of addressing a genuine dysfunction in the cosmic order. The Igigi are not expelled from the divine assembly. They are not confined beneath mountains or stripped of their divinity. They are relieved of their burden and reintegrated into the heavenly host. The narrative arc moves from complaint through confrontation to accommodation, a trajectory that carries no moral penalty for those who initiated the disruption. In a mythological landscape where rebellion against authority almost universally results in exile or damnation, this outcome is remarkably restrained. The restraint reflects something important about the theological sensibility of the tradition that produced the Atrahasis text. Mesopotamian religion, as preserved in the surviving literary and ritual corpus, was not primarily organized around concepts of moral purity or cosmic sin. It was organized around concepts of order, function, and balance. The gods were powerful, but not morally idealized. Enlil could be harsh and reactive. Inanna could be impulsive and destructive. Enki could be manipulative and self-serving. Divinity was not equated with virtue in the way that later, monotheistic traditions would increasingly insist upon. Within such a framework, the Igigi's rebellion did not need to be moralized. It could be understood as a systemic event, a pressure build-up that resulted in structural failure addressed through structural repair. The gods who refused to dig were not embodiments of cosmic evil. They were participants in an arrangement that had become unsustainable, and their refusal exposed the unsustainability rather than creating it. The Anunnaki's trembling in this reading was not righteous anger at transgression, but institutional anxiety at the failure of a design they had assumed would function indefinitely. The correction that followed was administrative rather than judicial. No trial was held, no sentence was pronounced. The problemus identified a solution was implemented, and the cosmos resumed operation in a modified configuration. This approach to divine rebellion stands in sharp contrast to traditions that emerged in later centuries across neighbouring cultures. The fall of the Watchers in the Enochic tradition is framed as moral catastrophe, their descent driven by lust, their punishment eternal, their legacy one of corruption that taints the earth and justifies divine destruction through flood. The fall of Satan in Christian theology carries even greater moral weight, becoming the foundational narrative of cosmic evil, the origin point for all subsequent temptation and sin. These traditions share with the Atrahasis account the basic structure of subordinate divine beings disrupting an established order, but they diverge entirely in how that disruption is interpreted. Where the Mesopotamian text sees labour dispute later, traditions see original transgression. Where the Atrahasis narrative resolves through compromise, later narratives resolve through permanent punishment. The difference is not merely one of storytelling preference. It reflects fundamentally different understandings of what divine order means, what threatens it, and what restoring it requires. In a cosmos governed by functional balance, disruption can be addressed through adjustment. In a cosmos governed by moral law, disruption requires judgment. The Igigi's exemption from condemnation may also reflect the social context in which the Atrahasis text was composed and preserved. Ancient Mesopotamian society depended visibly and directly on the labour of canal workers, brickmakers, agricultural labourers and construction crews. The exhaustion of those workers was not abstract, it was observable in the bodies that maintained the irrigation system sustaining every city in the alluvial plain. A myth that condemned divine labourers for protesting unbearable conditions might have sat uncomfortably in a culture where human labourers bore recognisably similar burdens. By treating the Igigi's complaint as legitimate by allowing the narrative to acknowledge that the work was too heavy and the system required change, the Atrahasis tradition preserved a space for empathy within the divine order. The gods who dug were not demons, they were workers. And workers, even divine ones, could reach the limits of what any system had the right to demand of them, without being redefined as enemies of the order they had sustained. That recognition, quiet, procedural, embedded in the administrative tone of the text rather than proclaimed as moral lesson, distinguishes the Igigi story from nearly every subsequent account of divine rebellion in the ancient world. The tablets do not celebrate the Igigi. They do not erect them as heroes of resistance or models of righteous defiance. They simply record what happened and what followed with the same measured cadence used to document the allocation of rations or the measurement of canal depths. The rebellion occurred. The system adapted. The gods resumed their places, no stigma attached. And in that absence of stigma, in the space where later traditions would insert damnation and moral ruin, the Atrahasis narrative preserves something that feels across the distance of nearly 4 millennia unexpectedly humane. The recognition that refusal born from genuine exhaustion is not the same as corruption, and that a system forced to change by those it depended upon is not a system destroyed, but a system that learned, however reluctantly, to listen, what the silence remembers. In the archives of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, fragments of the Atrahasis epic rest in climate-controlled sewage alongside thousands of other cuneiform tablets recovered from sites across the Mesopotamian plain. Some of these fragments are smaller than a human palm, others preserve columns of text dense enough to reconstruct entire episodes of the narrative. They were pressed into wet clay by scribes whose names, in most cases, have not survived. Though the colophon of the earliest known Old Babylonian copy records, the name Ku'aya, a junior scribe who completed his copy during the reign of Ammi-Saduqa in the 17th century BCE. The tablet he produced was itself a copy of an older tradition, one whose original composition may predate his lifetime by centuries. What he preserved carefully line by line in the angular script of his period was not his own invention. It was inheritance. A story passed through generations of scribal hands, each one transcribing what had been received, occasionally adjusting, occasionally compressing, but maintaining the essential architecture of a narrative that explained how the world came to be, maintained by mortal hands rather than divine ones. The clay has survived. The tradition behind it reaches further back than the clay itself into oral layers that no museum can house and no catalogue can number. The Igigi do not receive a farewell in the Atrahasis text. After the creation of humanity, after the labour is transferred and the canals pass into mortal custody, the younger gods recede from the narrative. They are not banished, they are not elevated, they are simply no longer the subject of the story. The tablets move forward toward the multiplication of humanity, the noise that disturbs Enlil, the escalating measures of plague and drought, and flood the survival of Atrahasis aboard his vessel, the post-Diluvian recalibration of divine and human relations. The Igigi become part of the background, listed occasionally in divine catalogues, mentioned in passing within hymns and ritual texts, but never again occupying the narrative centre they held during the rebellion. Their silence after the crisis is not erasure, it is absorption. They return to the divine order, and the divine order closes around them as water closes around a stone dropped beneath its surface. The shape is altered. The ripple fades and the seti in the surface appears undisturbed to anyone who was not watching when the stone fell. Yet the consequences of their refusal persist in every subsequent layer of the narrative. Humanity exists because the Igigi stopped digging. The sacrificial economy that sustains the gods' grain offered. At temple altars, animals slaughtered in ritual beer, poured into sacred vessels, exists because mortal hands replaced divine ones and required a framework of reciprocal obligation to maintain the arrangement. The flood exists because the beings created to solve one problem generated another. The post-flood constraints on human fertility and lifespan exist because unchecked growth proved as destabilizing as unchecked labor had been before it. Each development in the Atrahasis epic connects through a chain of consequence back to the night when tools were burned and gates were surrounded. The Igigi set the sequence in motion not through grand cosmic ambition, but through the simple, exhausted recognition that the work had become unbearable and that no relief would arrive unless they created the conditions for it themselves. Everything that followed creation, noise, plague, flood, survival, modification flowed from that initial refusal, the way water flows from the point where a canal is first cut into dry earth. The pattern they established, strain accumulating beneath a stable surface authority, failing to recognize the accumulation until it manifests as crisis adaptation following confrontation rather than preceding it, recurs not only within the Atrahasis narrative, but across the broader landscape of Mesopotamian mythology. It recurs in the Enuma Elish, where cosmic order emerges from violent upheaval. It recurs in the myths of Inanna's descent, where divine boundary crossing disrupts and then reconfigures the relationship between the living and the dead. It recurs in the historical inscriptions of kings who boast of restoring canals that had fallen into disrepair, implicitly acknowledging that the systems they governed required constant attention and periodic renewal. The Mesopotamian cosmos, as these traditions collectively portray, was not a finished product. It was an ongoing project maintained, disrupted, repaired, and maintained again in cycles that never fully resolve into permanent stability. The Igigi's rebellion was the first clearly articulated instance of that cycle within the mythic record. It would not be the last. What the tablets remember of the Igigi is therefore not a complete portrait. It is a set of cuneiform impressions preserving the outline of beings who are defined by labour, who endured that labour beyond the threshold of tolerance, and who forced the most powerful entities in their cosmos to acknowledge that power without cooperation cannot sustain the world it claims to govern. The trace is incomplete. The term Igigi blurs in later texts. The sharp distinction between them and the Anunnaki softens across centuries of scribal transmission. The psychological dimensions of their experience, the slow erosion of patience, the forming of collective resolve, the weight of repetition without reward are employed rather than stated, inferred by later readers from a text that moves with administrative brevity rather than narrative indulgence. The gaps in the record are real, the fragments are fragments, and the story, like all stories that have travelled through millennia of copying and recopying, carries the fingerprints of every hand that touched it, each scribe, preserving what seemed essential, each generation hearing the narrative through the filter of its own concerns. Yet something in the account resists reduction. The image of divine beings setting down their tools, gathering in darkness and standing together, outside the gate of authority, not to destroy, not to conquer, but to say that the burden has been carried long enough, carries a weight that does not depend on precise etymology or resolved scholarly debate. It speaks to something that the civilizations along the Tigris and Euphrates understood from direct experience, that the land does not maintain itself, that the work of sustaining order falls on specific shoulders, and that those shoulders, whether divine or human, have limits that no decree from above can override indefinitely. The tablets remember this. They remember it in the measured cadence of cuneiform script in the administrative language of a tradition that treated cosmic crisis with the same procedural calm it applied to canal measurements and ration distributions. They remember it without moral judgment, without celebration, without condemnation, simply as something that happened, something that mattered, and something that changed the structure of the world in ways that persisted long after the beings who initiated the change had faded into the quiet ranks of heaven. The clay holds what it holds. The rest, the whispered conversations before the burning, the texture of soil carried on divine shoulders, the sound of tools meeting flame in the dark belongs to the silence between the lines where the oldest stories continue to breathe for those willing to listen slowly enough to hear them. The tablet in the British Museum has not moved. BM78941 rests where it was catalogued under glass, under light calibrated to preserve what nearly 4,000 years of soil and silence did not destroy. The reed stylus impressions are still legible, angular, deliberate, pressed into clay that was once wet enough to hold the shape of a scribe's intention and then dried into something harder than the civilization that produced it. The lines that describe the Igigi's labour, their gathering in darkness, their march toward Enlil's gate, those lines remain. The clay remembers the pressure of the stylus, whether it remembers the weight of the baskets, the sound of tools meeting flame, or the silence that followed. When divine hands finally set down their burden is a different question. The object endures. What it holds is partial, and partial may be all that any record divine or human was ever meant to be. We have followed the traces. The tablets preserve the hierarchy that assigned to labour without Homer sharing at the decades of repetition that eroded divine patience, the night of collective refusal, the sacrifice that mingled blood with earth, the species that inherited the yoke, the noise that rose and the flood that answered it. We have noted where the narrative is clear and where it softens into ambiguity. The term Igigi sharpens in the Atrahasis account and blurs in later traditions. The number 40 functions with the precision of symbol rather than chronology. The parallels with later traditions of divine rebellion, the Watchers, the fallen angels, may reflect cultural transmission, or may reflect the independent tendency of hierarchical cosmologies to generate similar stories when pressed against the same questions of authority, endurance, and the limits of obedience. The tablets do not resolve these uncertainties. They were not composed to settle debates that would arise millennia after the last scribe set down his stylus. They were composed to record what a particular tradition understood about the origins of human labour, the structure of the divine realm, and the fragile interdependence between those who govern and those who sustain. That understanding was embedded in clay and offered forward without guarantee that the recipients would share the framework, the language, or the concerns of those who first shaped the words. Not every question raised by this narrative will find an answer. Some will remain suspended, not because the evidence is hidden, but because the evidence is genuinely incomplete. Fragments are missing from the Atrahasis tablets, lines are broken, entire sections exist only in later copies that may or may not preserve the original wording. The scribal tradition that maintained the text across centuries was careful but not infallible, and each generation of copyists worked within its own theological and literary sensibilities, potentially adjusting emphasis in ways we cannot always detect. What survives is enough to reconstruct the architecture of the story, but not enough to furnish every room within it. The gaps are real. They are not failures of the tradition. They are the natural condition of anything that has travelled this far through time, carried not by permanence, but by the repeated decision of individual hands to copy what seemed worth preserving, and to trust that the next pair of hands would do the same. Perhaps the question that lingers most quietly is not about the gods at all. It is about the pattern. A system is built. The system requires labour. The labour is assigned downward. The assignment is assumed to be permanent. It is not. The refusal reshapes the system. The reshaped system produces new pressures. The pressures are addressed. New pressures form. The cycle does not conclude. It turns. And somewhere within each turning, whether in the divine realm imagined by Mesopotamian scribes or in the landscapes those scribes inhabited, the same recognition surfaces that order maintained through unacknowledged burden is order waiting to be renegotiated by those who bear the weight. The tablets noticed this. They recorded it without judgment. Whether the pattern resolves or merely continues is something they left perhaps wisely for the silence to hold. Let your breathing settle now as the rivers of the ancient plain settled after the digging ceased and the water found its own level. The names carved into these tablets, Anu, Enlil, Enki, and the unnamed, many who carried the earth on their shoulders belonged to a world that measured its survival in canal depths and seasonal floods in the careful management of water across a landscape that forgave very little. Their stories travelled because someone thought they mattered enough to press into wet clay before the clay dried. Tonight they have travelled a little further. Let them rest where they are, traveller. The fragments hold what they hold. The spaces between them are not empty, they are simply quiet, the way all very old things grow quiet when they have said what they remember, and are ready at last to let the listener sleep.